Story 1. My first year of teaching, I was in a very disadvantaged middle school that had a rough reputation. As a teacher, I dealt with behaviors every day. About 2 months into the year, this little boy showed up one day. He was a new student who was about a head shorter than the rest of the children, dressed like a little adult, carrying his books in front of him, and had the biggest smile ever. He spoke almost no English, but sat in the very front of my classroom and meticulously copied down everything I wrote, ignoring all the off-task behaviors. I worked with him the best I could with my limited Spanish that I learned in high school. About 6 years later, I received a random email from him, letting me know that he had graduated high school and was going to Stanford University. He shared that I had an incredibly profound effect on his love of learning and thanked me for being so helpful and accommodating with him. Story 2. I had an 8th grade boy who was a happy-go-lucky goof who was more little kid than young teen. Because he was immature, he got picked on all the time. He would be upset and near tears but still smiling. I had to intervene for him and confront several students over it. I worried so much about him. In his sophomore year, my then-husband noticed he was small and recruited him to fill the 103-pound weight class on the wrestling team. He joined the team and was actually pretty good. He made it to the state championships all 3 years he was on the team. The team gave him a safe place to belong, and the bigger boys looked after him. The best moment, though, came during his senior year. The school invited the other county high school's team over for an exhibition match during the school day. I was so nervous for him because I knew he would have to wrestle a tough opponent in front of the whole school. I didn't want to see him defeated in front of everyone after he had come so far. I needn't have worried, though. He went out on that mat and absolutely dominated the opponent. He outperformed him at every turn and finally achieved a dramatic pin. The gym erupted with cheering that went on and on. He was 100% the hero of the school that day. Students talked about it for a week. That kid had my heart back in middle school, and it still brings tears to my eyes to think of how it turned out for him. Story 3. A brilliant, kind girl who would call out, "Bless you," to anyone sneezing, even if they were passing by in the hall. A top student and very responsible. Very charismatic. She would speak out on behalf of injustice. She won every public speaking contest. I ran a role-playing game creative writing session, and she wrote stories at about a 9th grade level while she was in 5th grade. She began wearing her glasses on a chain around her neck and wearing cardigans because I did. We were excited to follow her growth and always thought she would become prime minister one day. But she died of cancer in 9th grade, which was absolutely heartbreaking. I will never forget her or her lovely family. Story 4 had this kid in middle school. He was guaranteed to be involved in any shenanigans, had almost no impulse control, but he always owned up to things and responded kindly to kindness. One of those long-term projects. Stay the course, use all the patience, and cross your fingers. Then his dad took a gun and shot his mom, then shot himself. Both were dead, and the small community was in shock. The next day, the kid showed up to school. He said it was the only place in the world he felt safe. We supported each other, keeping it together in our classrooms, then retreating to our cars to just rock back and forth and cry. He graduated from grade 12 a few years ago. The whole town showed up, and the standing ovation went on forever. But it still hurts. Story 5. A kid in my tutor group at my first school was having a difficult time at home, always in trouble, getting into fights, and being kicked out of lessons. We clashed badly at first, but eventually, he trusted me and began to turn a corner with my intense support. We had sports day, and I gave him enough money to get ice cream for both of us from the stand. He did, and he came running back over with the biggest grin and 2 huge ice creams with sprinkles, sauce, and a flake each. He said it was the happiest he had ever been. A week later, I was on a rewards trip to a theme park, which he was not attending. At the end of the day, I checked my emails and found out he had brought a knife into school and been arrested. It turns out that he thought another student was going to fight him, so he was trying to protect himself. The school attempted to give him a chance to hand it over, but he refused, asking where I was. No one even tried to call the trip leader or anything so that I could speak to him. Because he would not hand it over, the school had to call the police, and he was expelled. I never found out what happened to him, but he almost certainly did not get to take his general certificate of secondary education exams and escape from the poverty his family had placed him in. If I had been there, I know he would have handed it to me. Story 6. I am a third-year teacher, but this experience is from my student teaching in graduate school. In the fall, my friends and I heard about a local serial killer. Fast forward to the spring semester, and I was placed in a third-grade classroom in January. There was a little girl whose mother had been released from incarceration and was just transitioning from living with her aunt and uncle back to living with her mother. Unfortunately, her mother was murdered by that serial killer. If grieving for her mother wasn't enough, this girl somehow got onto the internet and learned all the details of her mother's death. Understandably, this poor girl was angry and heartbroken. She would have huge tantrums and was constantly fighting with another little girl who was desperately trying to be her friend. During her breakdowns, she would say things to my mentor teacher like, "Why did the man take my mom away?" Or, "I wish you were God so you could bring my mom back." And it broke our hearts. That was 4 years ago. I hope she is doing okay. Story 7. I had a 16-year-old boy in my class. He was your typical troublemaker. One day, he looked upset. I pulled him aside after class and asked him what was wrong. He burst into tears and said no one ever cared about him enough to ask. He told me he hated life and wanted to die. I got him help, and 3 years later, he came back to visit me and said he was sorry for how he acted in class, and I was his favorite teacher. The next day, he killed himself. Story 8. I honestly have so many unforgettable moments. A little boy who had lived his whole life in a refugee camp and had never held crayons or scissors in his hands, beaming like a joyous little light bulb, was utterly thrilled to be in Canada and in school. A little girl from the United Arab Emirates who all but worshipped and always obeyed teachers. When told by my very dyslexic self to put away your lunch and eat your books, stared at me in confusion. She was clearly considering obeying but timidly wanted to double-check. So she asked, "Teacher, what did you say?" And a Chinese student about to experience his first snowfall, who, when advised that it probably wouldn't stay on the ground, asked in genuine scientific bewilderment, "How far off the ground will it stay?" Story 9. I asked my students what they want to become after 10 years. A lot of them answered with their desired careers and professions, but one student's response stood out to me the most. "I just want to be happy." Oh, how we all do. Story 10. My first year at a new school, I was teaching a college algebra class that was designed for students who needed an extra year to develop their math skills a bit more. They weren't ready for the next level, which would have been normal calculus or statistics, but there wasn't anything lower. There was no chapter goal for me to meet. The only goal was to help them improve. So anyway, on the first day of the new year at this new school, I forget exactly how this came up, but one of the girls said, "This is the class for kids who are not good at math." So I explained to her that they aren't not good at all and that they are all smart in their own ways, even if it might not be in math. She ended up having a great year and finished with a high B. I learned that many of her math-related issues were because other teachers had told her she was bad at math. The next year, she took regular statistics with me and excelled. It was only a half-year class, so I did not see her again until she graduated that same year. At graduation, she told me she tested into pre-calculus, the level she should be at for what she wanted to study, and she was very excited about that. I will never forget that girl and all her hard work and how you don't have to do a lot to help people change the way they view themselves, a subject or a topic. Story 11. I had a student years later tell me my classroom made them feel safe. Apparently, they had been going through challenges I did not even realize at the time, but my room was one place they knew they could just be themselves. They were always someone I was going to remember, but the moment they told me that was so impactful that I cannot forget them. Story 12. A student who was somewhat talkative and cheeky, not particularly well liked by other teachers, but I saw a lot of potential. I wrote "Star of the Future" in her report when she was 13. By the end of school, she had earned an A in my subject, was head girl, and later obtained a law degree. Story 13. I keep in touch with a lot of my students as I taught high school. In my first year, I taught a student with severe anxiety. They had to wear a hat for comfort and to feel safe. Their goal was to present to the class without the hat by the end of the year. They accomplished it, and they slowly stopped wearing the hat altogether. They said I gave them the confidence to do so and gifted me a painting. It is still hanging on my wall 12 years later. This experience made me realize I could really do this and be a positive influence on young lives. Story 14. I once had a student, easily in her 70s, who was looking for a career change and wanted to become a nurse. She let me know that she had won a Mississippi St. Paul Senior Beauty Contest, and during introductions on the first day of class, she recited poetry, as I teach a biology class. She liked to give me random items from her house as tokens of appreciation. I still have a huge howling wolf statue in my office, which was a gift from her. She was great. Story 15. Preschool teacher here. There was a girl named Melody. At age 3, everyone knew she was autistic. She had few words and behavioral issues. I was her teacher for 2 years and started by establishing a trusting relationship with her, being silly and giggling when she would make jokes about things that only she could get away with. I then worked on other skills as she knew she could trust me. She came from a very poor and trauma-filled background, and I watched her thrive with support and consistency. She is the one kid I always ponder how she is doing. She also asks me funny questions like, "Do you know Jackson Michael?" Story 16. I worked at a Title I school briefly. The school was brand new and had a highly problematic administration. I kept my room open for any students who needed to drop by between or after class to ask questions, pick up work, or get a snack. There was one student who was obviously struggling. He was getting into trouble daily, and the administrators often punished him instead of trying to find the source of these issues. Some of the things he was getting pulled into the office for were almost laughable, and so he was getting more and more unruly as the school year dragged on. He got into a habit of wandering the halls to escape class and, on more than one occasion, ended up in my room or at the door. Sometimes he talked to me. Sometimes he just wanted to sit in silence. I always gave him a few moments before sending him back, letting him regroup as much as possible. One day, he randomly asked me if I believe in God. I danced around the issue as best as I could, giving a non-answer. He replied that he believed in God and thanked me every night for letting him relax in my room. He always asked for my protection. He then grabbed 3 bags of chips and walked out. That was almost 5 years ago, but I think about him often and hope he is doing well. Story 17. After 30 years, I have many memories, but I am going to talk about Rose here. In the 11th grade of high school, Rose came from a family that did not believe in girls requiring an education. She moved to my country to escape and obtain an education. What I remember about her was her thrill and appreciation for being in class and having the opportunity to learn. I taught science, and she would be amazed by the human body. She walked into my class after English and rapturously announced the beauty of the poem she was reading. She worked hard to achieve success. It was a joy to work with someone who did not take free education for granted. She lit up my classroom that year. Story 18. 2 spring to mind for me. A beautiful 5-year-old who was in foster care with her 3-year-old sister. They had both been sexually abused and had food issues. They went together to a loving adopted family, and I cried. I hope they are happy. Then, on the other hand, a small boy who made a whining noise all day and every day. I tried everything to help, support, and stop that noise. He wasn't happy with anything and made that high-pitched noise. There were no special educational needs issues, and when I spoke to his parents, they said, "Oh yeah, he does that at home too. 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 12 weeks each term, 3 terms per year. I really hope he's happy too." Story 19. I am not a teacher, but I do want to say I am touched that most of the teachers replying are recalling how they helped a child who got dealt a bad hand through no fault of their own. You are amazing. Thank you for what you do. Story 20. A Somali refugee student whom I was tutoring in English, as the assistant classroom teacher, was asked by the leading teacher to create drawings that represented their childhood. The Somali student drew a picture of an entire neighborhood of Somali houses on fire. Story 21. Not a teacher anymore, but I taught preschool for years. Alexis M. was adopted with her little sister Brooke. I was so young at the time, I didn't realize most of her challenging behavior likely came from the trauma of her earliest years. This little girl would stand in front of you and wet her pants, despite being fully potty trained, when she didn't want to do something. She'd climb furniture with a quickness I'd never seen before in humans. She once kicked me so hard in the stomach that I vomited. But I loved that little girl. I became extremely close with her whole family and spent summers babysitting them at their house. We lost touch for years when my husband joined the military but reconnected again when she was around 18. Unfortunately, life had not been the best for her, and I was no longer able to give her the support she needed. I will always wonder what happened to my little Lexi. Story 22. I am not a teacher, but I used to tutor in a middle school special education classroom. I loved it. The kids were all really nice and eager to learn. One boy in particular sticks with me, though. He was new that year and couldn't read more than a few words. His old school apparently just didn't have good special education resources, so he fell through the cracks. He truly wanted to learn, so he worked on it every day with different tutors. By the end of the year, this child who used to barely read was reading chapter books. It was still way below the reading level of his peers, but I was so proud of him. He worked so incredibly hard. Story 23. I have two for different reasons. But I once taught a lovely student who was always complaining of headaches in phonics. The running joke between his family and me was that he hated phonics. He started throwing up one week, was off sick for a week, then returned to school and threw up so violently that I had to cut his jumper off him as it was covered and I could not get it over his head. It turns out he had a brain tumor and was about an hour from death by the time his family got him to the hospital. They stopped the brain bleed that was going to kill him, and then we all waited to see if they could operate. They did, and he survived. I had a little cry watching him in the nativity grumpily wearing tinsel because he could have so easily not been with us. He still hates phonics. Story 24. I have a sad story. I work at an alternative school on the south side of Chicago. We get all kinds of students for all kinds of reasons, but back when I first started, the majority of the students had not been successful at the Chicago public schools in terms of grades, attendance, and behavior, so you can imagine many of my high schoolers were challenging. This student started about halfway through the academic year, and I noticed right away that he had a constant habit of deflecting. No lesson and no conversation could stay on track for very long. He would always find some way to interject and throw it off, and not in a way typical of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Yes, there was something impulsive about it, but also purposeful. I didn't quite know what to make of it, though. He was smart enough. Not a secret genius or anything, but if I could get our conversation back on track, he could grasp the takeaway and maybe add something insightful. Despite his antics, I liked him, and in a strange way, I had a sense he liked me as well. I requested to have him in my homeroom to see if I could support him better or get through to him somehow. I made slow progress. Then one day, quite randomly, while he and I stood in a circle with a couple of his friends, just having a casual conversation, he revealed the truth. His older brother had been shot right in front of him and bled out to death in his arms. He said it so offhandedly, and then the conversation moved on. Oh, I processed it, that's what it is. That's why any hint of vulnerability or stability makes you nervous. Something happened with him that caused him to be expelled from the school. We do not expel students often, but sometimes it is so egregious that we have no choice. I remember there being a sad sense of resignation that we would have to let him go. He drowned while swimming in a lake in Minnesota. When I read the message from a coworker, all I could think about was him cradling his brother while he died. No one held him. Story 25. A boy with autism who loved with his whole heart. He knew all the statistics for his favorite teams, and he would regularly come into my room at lunch to talk about hockey and football, oblivious to the fact that I had zero knowledge to match his, but happy to teach me nonetheless. He once did a presentation about his father, who had succumbed to a heart attack, then apologized for going over time as I bawled at the back of the classroom. Every time I hear "Free Bird," I think of him because his assessment of the song turned from, "What is this garbage?" to, "Okay, I guess it's fine," which made me belly laugh. He passed away in an accident shortly before he was supposed to graduate. Story 26. Furkan. This is a complicated story. temping as a mathematics teacher at an international school. I had a job in high technology as a development engineer, but I persuaded my employers to let me stand in teaching mathematics at the school temporarily while they tried to find someone permanent. Our management had just written a stiff letter to the government pointing out its deficiencies in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education, so I challenged them to put their money where their mouth was, and they stepped up. Anyway, Furkan was one of my students, and he tried really hard, really hard. I helped him as much as I could with tutoring in school and outside school hours. Then, one day, I handed out the results of the latest test, and Furkan, for the first time in his life, had obtained a sufficient. He was so excited that he got up, ran out of the classroom to go and tell his mentor, and burst into the mentor's classroom in the middle of lessons shouting, Sir, I got a sufficient in mathematics. Yeah, Furkan, you rocked. Story 27. In the 1980s, I was teaching 7th grade at a private school. One of my students' families took in a Cambodian girl who had survived the killing fields and a couple of years in a Thailand refugee camp. She was a bit older than my 7th graders but was learning English. Her family was all missing and probably dead, as her father had been a doctor. I would spend every free moment working with her and still have a whole folder of photocopied papers and pictures she drew explaining her life. She was a survivor. That summer, I was invited over to her house when she had other Cambodian refugee kids get together. She was such a positive person. Most of her friends were understandably struggling. I wish I knew what happened to her. Story 28. I was teaching preschool in the inner city. My student was 3 years old and had 2 older sisters. His mother lost all of them. For some reason, the sisters were placed in one foster home, while my little boy was placed in another. The only constants in his life were taken away. Additionally, he had some language delays, so at 3 years old, he was speaking in 2 to 3 word phrases rather than full sentences. 2 days after he was placed in foster care, he lost control and could not stop crying. I held him throughout lunch and nap time as he cried and wailed, intermittently yelling, "Somebody help me! Somebody help me!" We sat together, crying in my desk chair for over an hour. Working with this lost, damaged child wore me down. Story 29. The girl whose mother was a prostitute, Sonia R., was someone I taught in 2000. She was actually an okay kid, but she was often kicked out of class. I got along fairly well with her, though. One day, she was out of class again, and I walked past her in the corridor. She stared at me and, how do I say this politely, pretended that the lollipop she had was something else. The corridor was empty apart from us. It was perhaps the most uncomfortable and unsettling experience I've had as a teacher. I was 21 years old, a new teacher, and had no idea what to do. I knew that if I told management, the police would be involved with her again, and she would be excluded again, so I just pretended it didn't happen and hurried off. I was leaving that job anyway, so I basically avoided her completely, which was fairly easy to do in a big high school. I often wondered what became of her and her brother. Poor kids. Some people shouldn't be parents. Story 30. My mom was a teacher, and once I visited her class. A student said, "Forget your mom. She is unkind." I was shocked and thought, what is going on? But I was only 8, so I couldn't do anything. Story 31. About a decade ago, I had a really sweet and funny boy. He reminded me of Sunshine from Remember the Titans, except his sport was swimming. He had long blonde hair in a small southern town, and he hung around with a group of really goofy, lovable boys who were just into hanging out, playing games, making silly videos, and more. The other boys didn't stand out as much as he did because of his hair, which often was green because he took swimming as his physical education class. He would often come running into my class late, hair still dripping, and his cheeks would be all pink from the sprint across campus. I never wrote him up for being late because it wasn't his fault. He tried so hard and had such a funny personality. He was into drawing and always had the funniest, most absurdly drawn little cartoons for his projects. But kids were mean. He looked different, he was constantly wet, he was pretty vocal about his interests, which weren't that unusual but were, I guess, weird for the town, and he was so goofy. When I had him, I always felt like he handled the comments and stares so well. It all seemed to roll right off his back. But even the teachers were mean and judgmental. I remember a coworker who taught the same subject watched him run past into my room one day, and she said, "Ugh, I'm so glad I don't have him in my room. He looks dirty." And I said he was awesome, and I was glad to have him because he was, and I was. Anyways, I loved the whole group, but this particular boy came back year after year. Well into high school, I had him for 7th grade because our campuses were connected. He'd have to wait between the end of school and swim practice, and he'd poke his head in and say, "Hey, miss, can I help you do something?" Or he'd tell me about what was going on with his buddies or his little girlfriend, who he had loved since I taught him. Or he'd ask for advice on an assignment in my subject. He was just looking for time to kill. Sometimes he'd drag along a friend who'd obviously be like, "Dude, why are we willingly spending more time with a teacher?" Sometimes I'd be rushing out the door to get to one thing or another, and he'd pop in, and I'd go, "Oh, hey, buddy, I'm so sorry I can't let you hang out today." He was always sweet about it, and he'd walk out to the front with me before heading back to the aquatic center. He had a sweet family and such a good group of friends, but he made a point to come say hey and remind me that I was still his favorite. By the time he had gotten into high school, he'd lost the goofy baby fat look, he'd cut his hair, he'd gotten all lean and muscular from swimming constantly. He was really coming into his own, and he was an honors student, so he had everything going for him on the surface. And then one morning, I woke up to a school-wide email and several texts from some swim moms who I was in a book club with. Their sons were in the little goofball crew and on the swim team. They had been best buddies for their whole lives, so they were the first to find out. He was gone. It wasn't the first time he had tried. He had battled depression for his whole life. His family had tried absolutely everything to save him. He would be doing wonderful things. I just know it. His soul was too good for this world. His funeral was packed with people, and I remember feeling the absence of people from the school who should have been there and feeling so angry at some of the ones that were there and had no right to be. I hope the things they said to that boy and the way they tried to make him feel haunts them. But I will never forget him, and I will never turn a kid away from my door, because if you had asked me if he was depressed, I would have called you crazy. And sometimes I wonder if he just needed some consistency and to know someone who didn't have to care still cared, and that's why some days he'd show up. It doesn't really matter, I guess, but I think about him often. Story 32. I had a student who had a very rough time. His father was incarcerated, and his mother had different boyfriends every couple of weeks. He never had lunch, so I would sneak snacks and food into his backpack and locker. However, his situation made him tough. He was physically rough with other kids, would swear constantly, and always tried to be sneaky and break rules. His behavior just got worse and worse, and despite how much I tried to connect, he was an extremely difficult student. I really hope he manages to turn things around, but I have recently heard that he was arrested for theft and might go to a juvenile detention center. It is just so sad. It is not fair. Story 33. She was the cousin of the valedictorian of the grade level. I taught 9th grade English and she didn't speak any English at all. I worked with her every day, assigned Rosetta Stone, printed out articles in both English and Spanish and had them side by side. I tutored her twice a week and gave her all the help she needed. She did not pass the state exam that year, but the following year, she passed both the 9th and 10th grade state exams. She had to move back to Mexico because of a family emergency, and I didn't see her for 4 years. My last year of teaching, I attended prom for the seniors and she was invited by a guest as a +1. She bawled her eyes out when she saw me. She hugged me, thanking me for believing in her and never giving up on her. She spoke perfect English and she was going to college. She kept telling me I changed her life. I still cry whenever I think about her. She is an amazing human. She deserves the world. She was one of the hardest working students I have ever taught. She worked incredibly hard and never took school for granted. Story 34. Wow, where do I start? His dad had left and he was behind in school, but he made a lot of progress that year. I was his teacher. I got transferred and told him I would be in another part of the building the next year and that he could come find me. I got transferred again 2 days before school started, and I wasn't there. When I did see him again, he said, "You said you would be here." That ripped my heart out. 20 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. In my second year of teaching, I had many challenging students with severe behavior problems. I remember each and every one of them. Story 35. Okay, this one is difficult, but his memory deserves to live on. I had a bright, shining student who was very interested in history, science, art, and costumes. I mean, this young man made his own chainmail by hand. He was eccentric as he loved to dress up and be a child while the other middle schoolers were trying to convince themselves they were adults. He would come to my after-school club and make swords out of paper and share his love of crafting with the other boys. He was so fun to be around, and others gravitated to his undeniable aura. As you can imagine, he faced bullying from his peers in middle school. However, he was accepted into a prestigious science, technology, engineering, and mathematics high school, and I thought he would do great in an environment with more like-minded, smarter peers. When we were told that he took his own life, my heart broke. He had apparently hung himself during his sophomore year. I found out in the middle of the school day and had to tell my students that allergies were really bothering me to explain my watery eyes. I do not have allergies. The world is missing one less incredible artist, historian, and human being. I envy what the world would look like today if he were still in it. I bring him up every Suicide Awareness Week to remind my students to check on even the brightest and happiest of our friends. He should still be with us today, shining his light and making the mundane a little brighter. The world is a little dimmer without him. I will miss you, little buddy. Story 36. Two students placed together in a seating plan for 4 years in a row. I made a bet with other teachers that they would be together. They did not believe me. They are now married, invited me to their wedding, and have 2 children. I earned £100 from the teachers. They first met in year 3. Both were funny and hardworking students, mainly funny. Story 37. Tiny blonde cheerleader from Texas. Tengo Kensei Anyos. While technically correct, she twanged the heck out of that sentence. And now that phrase lives rent-free in my head. Story 38. Wow, I have so many mostly positive memories, but I often think of 2 that stand out. 2 young men in 4th to 6th grade whom I got to know really well. They are most memorable because I had to file Child Protective Services reports on their parents. I was young, about 23 years old, and it was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. But I knew deep down it was the right thing to do. If anything, I felt helpless because somehow these boys trusted me and were able to feel vulnerable enough to tell me things I wish I had never heard. Being entrusted with such private information felt like a burden at the time, but I felt and still feel lucky enough to have had administrative support. Looking back, I wish I could know how they are doing now. I know they must be in their mid-20s. I live in the same community, and I do look in my local newspaper's crime log, hoping never to come across any of my past students, but it definitely lingers in my mind what some of them are up to now. I have many more uplifting stories, but somehow my troubled students are the ones I think of most often. Another little guy was in 6th grade and used to play the ukulele under this huge oak tree on the big playground at one of the campuses I taught at. He would play the song Riptide and sing along. Every time I hear that song, I think of the most peaceful memories of little children gathered around him listening to him impromptu jamming. Another little child in transitional kindergarten I was teaching at the time was doing marble art with me, where we would dunk marbles in paint and let them roll around on paper inside a box. And at age 4, he said really quietly, "Looks like Jackson Pollock." That blew me away, and I still laugh about it to this day, about 18 years later. I could go on and on. I taught for 9 years in kindergarten through 6th grade, and my dreams at night still involve classroom shenanigans. One of my favorite little students raised his hand while we were going through iPad rules and technology time and shared, "Well, my dad always brings his phone to the toilet and plays on it." The crowd erupted in laughter. He is 6 years old. His father was a big deal at Sony and a really upstanding gentleman. Poor guy. I wonder what else that little son has been sharing on his father's behalf since then. I wouldn't change my time in the classroom for anything. Story 39. I am not a teacher, but I have a story. I will never forget my middle school math teacher, Mr. Robinson, from 2004 to 2006. He was everyone's favorite, or maybe he just commanded respect. Maybe a bit of both. He suggested I needed glasses after realizing I could not see the blackboard. I went from a C minus to an A in a few weeks. He was also notorious for having a microwave and a supply of hot chocolate and marshmallows when, in his words, "You earn it by acting decent and doing good work." One day, I was heading into his class, and some older and bigger kids decided to mess with me, playing keep away with my backpack. I did not get mad, violent, or call them names, but I was not fast enough either. All I could do was watch my bag go here and there. "Give it back, please." As soon as the bell rang, they tossed my bag back to me. I was a mess. I came in before everyone else, quietly crying. Mr. Robinson asked if I was okay. I quietly said, "Not really," and took my seat at the front. He immediately gave me a hot chocolate and smothered it with marshmallows. It was my first and only one. I still do not know if he had seen what happened or just noticed that I was in bits and really needed cheering up. But 20 years later, I still think about that little kindness he showed me. I am a little sad that I could not say thank you all these years later. Thank you, teachers, for being there for your kids. You rock. There is still good in this world, and it is worth fighting for. Tolkien. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.